If you were to go to Bytom in Poland these days, it is quite a big place. But several hundred years ago, Bytom was a tiny little place, a village, barely even a village, really. And in that poky little village, there existed a farmhand, Pavel. And Pavel was a big lad, as farmhands so often are. And he had a big heart to go with his big muscles. A kind, gentle lad who cared for his family, his poor old mother, his 16 younger brothers and sisters. His father had died of exhaustion long since. And he was doing his best to make ends meet, but farmhanding, whilst it's a job with much to recommend it, I'm sure, doesn't tend to bring in the money. And one day, Pavel heard tell a story of a monstrous beast, a dragon, a great fire-breathing monstrous lizard that dwelt on a hill a couple of miles from Bytom. And this beast apparently had eaten no end of knights and brave warriors and soldiers and what have you, and hoarded their fortunes and their treasures to himself. And Pavel got to thinking, if he were able to slay the dragon, to kill Krepel, or at least wound him, if not actually outright kill him, then he could grab some of the treasure for himself and bring it back, and buy his mother and his many brothers and sisters a decent house to live in instead of one with a leaky roof and an outside toilet that, well, the less said about that, the better. He wanted to look after his family, and so this seemed to him the best way to do it. Now, he knew very little about dragon slaying. I mean, in all honesty, who does? But he felt it'd be worth practicing. He would need a weapon, and he should practice with a weapon before just pitching up there. I mean, he may have been a big lad, but he certainly was not a stupid lad. So he got himself a stick, and before you make any sarcastic comments, this was purely for practice. It was a big old stick, and he imagined in his mind that this great big old stick was a sword. And he'd take himself off to a tree, and every day he'd spend hours swinging his imaginary sword at a tree, practicing blows and parrying and fighting. And when the other farmhands noticed what he was doing, some of them, of course, just laughed at him, but some listened and said, well, it's all well and good fighting a tree, but what you need is something that takes a swing back at you so that you can get used to the dodging and the weaving. And so a couple of the other big farm lads would take turns in getting big sticks of their own, and they'd sit there and battle it out and strike blows and thrust and parry and dodge and, well, some might think it play, but others might see it as good practice at future swordsmanship. Now, as to the getting of a sword, well, under most circumstances this would be way outside the financial remit of just about any farmhand, for swords are expensive things. But Pavel's grandfather's grandfather had, back in his century, been a brave man, a fierce man, a soldier. And when he had died, he had left his, well, by that time, practically only possession to his son. And the sword had passed down from son to grandson to great-grandson and so on, down all the way down into Pavel's father's hands, and then to Pavel himself. And by that point in time, it has to be said, the sword was really quite rusty and blunt and had seen better days, many better days. But there was no way on earth that Pavel could afford a brand new sword, and so he had to make do and mend. And he thought once he'd got used to fighting with a branch, he could then employ the sword itself. And he had a few pennies saved up, and he went along to the blacksmith and said, could you do something, you sharpen the edges, do something with it to give it a bit of substance. And the blacksmith, as tradesman, the world over, looked at it and sucked his teeth and thought, well, it'll take some doing. It's so close to falling apart. I don't want to do too much to it. If I take too much of this rust off, the whole thing will fall to pieces. But he did what he could, for he liked Pavel. Everybody liked Pavel. He was a nice lad. And so he put as much of an edge on the sword as this poor bit of rusted old metal could take, and he charged the absolute bare minimum for it. And he did his best as he was sorting out the sword for Pavel to try and talk the lad out of it, because of course by this point in time, small villages being what they are, absolutely everybody and their cat knew precisely what Pavel was planning to do. And the majority of villagers thought he was really quite foolish and silly, and they hoped he would turn back and be dissuaded, that his mother would convince him not to go, and she'd had a damn good try at convincing him not to go. But Pavel was determined there was no other way that he could possibly make money doing anything else in order to buy the house for his mother. And no matter how much she said she didn't want a better house, he knew perfectly well she did, and perfectly well that his many brothers and sisters needed a better house and a bit of an education and better food on the table and all sorts of things that they could do with, really. New shoes and well, the list goes on and on and on. So come the day when he had practiced as much as he felt he needed to practice with the branch, and he had the sword, and he didn't want to practice too much with the sword because he felt if he clonked it into a tree in his practice it might break the blade, and well, I suppose clonking it into a dragon might break the blade as well, but at least he'd get a good blow in, and that might be enough to either kill the dragon or stun it, or leave it injured enough that he could grab a few pocketfuls of coins and rubies and diamonds and whatnot from the treasure hoard and run off. So he gave it a go. Off he went, following the directions he'd been given. Mile after mile he walked through forest that got thicker and bigger, and the trees bolder and more ancient and gnarled and twisted, until eventually, following those directions he'd been given, he came to, well, I suppose you might call it a clearing of sorts, but not the kind of beautiful natural clearing that you get in a forest. Rather, it was a very large burnt patch. There were stumps of charcoaled trees, and the last earthly remains of burnt up bushes and shrubbery, and the incinerated bones of what might have been a deer or possibly a wild boar or something. Bits of animal and bits of tree all over the place. And he walked for several yards through this burnt out clearing in the forest, and he started to notice that amongst the incinerated bits of wild boar and deer and bear and what have you, there were bits of armour, gauntlets and helmets and breastplates. There were chewed up, battered looking shields. There were weapons, but they were all broken into pieces. So he didn't fancy picking any of them up and swapping for his rusted sword from his grandfather's grandfather. And he got closer and closer to the hill that rose in the midst of this great burnt circle within the forest. And he'd heard tell that upon this hill was the home of the dragon, that there was an entrance somewhere in the hill itself, and the hill was hollow, and the dragon, the Krepel, lived inside that hollowed hill. And he crunched his way up, trying to move quietly, but when you're a big lad and all of the plant life around you is burnt to a cinder, it's very hard not to make crunching noises as you clamber up. And he got halfway up and he noticed an opening in the hill a couple of yards ahead of him. And he drew the sword and said a silent prayer and wondered what on earth the dragon would really look like. I mean, he had one described to him, and he'd seen carvings of things in churches, but who knows how accurate any of them are. When a voice thundered out of the darkness of the hill, and it said, Why do you wish to pick so unequal a fight? I pose no threat to you, boy. And Pavel was quaking in his boots and very nearly dropped the sword. Why should we not meet as friends? "Rather than enemies," said the voice. And Parvel coughed and spluttered and said, "Well, I don't know." His voice going up a few octaves with sheer fear. He'd never heard of dragons being able to speak before. "Well," said the dragon, "you cannot come in here, for this is a small cave, and it is very dirty. I haven't had time to clear properly the remains of my last few meals. Rather, come and visit me in my other home, my winter home, and we shall have tea. Let me go and put the kettle on." And with that, something huge and enormous and scaly and winged emerged from the opening in the hill and flapped its vast wings and took off, and Parvel fell backwards and rolled down the hill and just lay there staring up into the sky, quite stunned, and watched this huge shape flying off, and pulled his wits together and thought, well, what else are you supposed to do? I mean, if somebody invites you for tea, it's rude not to go. And he was feeling a bit hungry by this point in time. It'd been a long walk through the forest. And he could see the dragon off in the sky, and so he began to trudge in the same direction that the dragon was flying. And it may be that the dragon flew rather slowly on purpose, or perhaps it always flew rather slowly. I mean, who can really say? Who knows enough about dragons to comment upon the matter? But it moved at slow enough a pace that Parvel never quite lost sight of it, even when he walked out of the great burnt patch and back into the forest. He could still, through the trees, see the dragon in the distance, so he knew that he was always going in the right direction. And after about 3/4 of a mile, the dragon began to lower in the distance, coming in for a landing. And Parvel made his way in the direction of where the dragon appeared to be landing, and there was another hill in the forest. This one was surrounded by trees and bushes and flowers, and there was a little river making its way across. No burnt patch, no discarded bits of chewed up blackened bone, no earthly remains of knights and brave warriors. Just a hill with an opening. And Parvel went up the hill, and his knees were knocking, and he wondered if this was some rather complicated trick. He couldn't imagine why the dragon would need to lure him towards a completely different place in order to kill him. I mean, if he was going to kill him, he could have killed him in the burnt hill, let alone in this one. But up he went, and by this point he had put his sword back into the scabbard, and he approached the opening, and light began to emerge from the darkness. Come in, said the dragon. And into the cave he went. And there, in this enormous hollow hill, there was the dragon taking up half the space, and he was a huge leathery beast, even with his wings folded down. And the dragon beckoned him in, and there was a chair, a human-sized chair rather than a dragon-sized chair, and there a table made out of a chopped log set up. And despite the enormously large claws that the dragon had, it was picking up very delicately cups and a teapot and a great metal kettle. And it breathed fire onto the great metal kettle until it started to bubble and boil and steam, and the whistle came out shrill through the lid, and the dragon picked off the little whistle and poured the water into the teapot and made tea for them, and opened a tin and served cake, very good cake, fruit cake of course, because that's what dragons like to eat when they're not eating deer and wild boar and knights in armour. And they sat and they had a very nice, very filling tea. And the dragon said, "Why is it you come to kill me, boy? You are no knight. And that sword you have at your waist has seen better centuries, I wager." And Pavel explained that the sword had belonged to his grandfather's grandfather, and that the family had somewhat come down in financial terms, and he was now a farmhand and doing his best to make a living, but he had his poor old mother and his many brothers and sisters to look after, and the roof was leaking, and shoes had holes in them, and there wasn't enough food to put on the table every night. And he explained he'd heard the story that the dragon had treasure. "Indeed I do, said the dragon, "and I am touched by your story. But rather than fight me for my treasure, why do you not simply ask for a loan?" Well, Pavel was somewhat taken aback. He'd never so much as spoken to a bank manager, let alone a dragon, and I'll grant you sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. But he scratched his head and he thought, I don't know, I didn't realise dragons made loans. "We don't," said the dragon, "for people never pay them back. We do, however, sometimes give money to those we like. And Pavel, I like you." And at the end of their rather nice tea, the dragon opened a chest in which there were gold coins and silver coins and rubies and pearls and diamonds and emeralds and sapphires and chalices and platters and all manner of fabulous things. And it gestured to a sack hanging on a hook and asked Pavel to bring the sack over, and he brought it over, and the dragon took a fistful of treasure and dropped it into the sack and said, "Take this! Buy your mother and your siblings a better house. Put food on their table, shoes on their feet, and come back whenever you would like more cake. For I am lonely, and knights are very poor conversationalists." And so Pavel, much relieved, went home, and was the talk of the village and people all over Bitum. Not that that was a very far distance, but they came to listen to his tale of this amazing dragon, and how friendly the dragon was, and how kind and how generous, and well, Bitum grew a little and a little and a little, for Pavel invested the money wisely. Once he'd provided with the better home and the new shoes and the better food on the table, he used that money to improve not only his own life and the lives of his brothers and sisters and his mother, but the lives of other villagers. And so the community grew larger, it grew more prosperous, people grew happier, and families multiplied and new people moved there, which is why Bitum is a much larger place these days than it was a good few hundred years ago in Pavel's lifetime. But Pavel never forgot the dragon, would often go and visit and have tea and cake with him, and share the stories of his life and the accomplishments of his brothers and sisters as they got older. He'd share the joys of their achievements and the tragedy when his poor old mother a few years later died, although she died happy, but it is still sad nonetheless that she did. And the dragon, because of course dragons live an awfully long time, shared stories of his life and all of the many things he'd done over the centuries. And to remember the dragon in Pavel's great old age, he donated money to a local church to have a carving made of a dragon, which is to still be seen in Bytom in Poland to this very day. And so dragons sometimes can be friendly when they are bearded in their dens. And if you go and have tea and cake with them, you'll find that swords are quite unnecessary. In fact, you'll need no more dangerous a weapon than a cake knife.